The Arizona sun pounded the desert like a hammer, flattening colors, baking the earth, and smothering every living thing with its fierce, breathless heat as Thomas Reddington guided his exhausted horse across the cracked plain, a man driven less by hope than by stubbornness, returning to his isolated ranch after trading 3 weeks' worth of supplies in Tucson, unaware that fate had marked this day for an encounter that would ripple across the entire Apache territory, because as he reached the foothills near Dead Man's Wash, he spotted a silhouette, a massive figure, swaying, staggering, almost collapsing beneath the weight of the sun, and as he rode closer, his hand instinctively drifting toward the old Colt on his belt, he realized it was a girl, or rather a young woman, towering, broad-shouldered, unmistakably Apache, her breath ragged, her lips cracked white, and her dark eyes unfocused with delirium. She carried no weapons, only a broken pot and a bundle of herbs bound to her back, and without a word she crumpled to her knees in front of his horse as Thomas swung down, torn between caution and the plain humanity of what he saw. This wasn't a scout. This wasn't a threat. This was someone dying of thirst. And with a sigh he uncorked his last full canteen, wondering if this act of kindness would do nothing more than leave him parched before nightfall. But she seized the water with trembling hands, drinking with gasps and coughs until she pulled away, pressing a fist to her chest in a gesture he didn't fully understand but felt was gratitude. And though Thomas urged her to rest in the shade of the cottonwoods nearby, she shook her head fiercely, pointing toward the distant mountains, where black smoke curled faintly into the sky. He didn't know her name, didn't know her tribe, beyond the obvious markings on her clothing that marked her as of the White Mountain Band, one of the proudest and most fearsome Apache groups in the region. But he knew trouble when he saw it, and he knew she was alone, wounded, and far from home. So he lifted her gently onto his horse and led them both toward his ranch, a modest spread nestled between red cliffs and a shallow creek, the kind of quiet place a man builds when he wants the world to forget him. And though he sensed danger in offering shelter to an Apache, he pushed the thought aside, tending to her injuries, giving her food, and watching as she slowly regained strength, her gaze never losing that fierce, proud fire that warned him she was no ordinary wanderer. When night fell, she finally spoke her name, Ayanna, and though her English was broken, the weight of her words chilled Thomas to the bone as she warned him that she had not simply been lost, but fleeing an enemy raid that had struck her village, and she feared the warriors of her own people might suspect an outsider of involvement when they found her trail leading toward the valley. Thomas shrugged off the warning, believing conflict would pass him by as it always had, believing tomorrow would look just like yesterday. But as the dawn bled red across the horizon, the earth began to tremble with the thunder of hooves, first faint, then unmistakable, then overwhelming, until he stepped onto his porch and saw them, cresting the ridge in a wave of dust and painted faces, more warriors than he had ever dreamed could gather in one place, at least 300 strong, circling his ranch with silent, terrifying precision, every bow drawn, every spear lowered, every eye burning with suspicion and vengeance. And at their head rode the war chief himself, a mountain of a man whose gaze swept the ranch like a blade before falling upon Thomas with a look that declared judgment had already been made. And in that moment Thomas realized that the simple act of handing water to a dying girl had placed him at the center of a storm he might not survive. The circle tightened around the ranch with the slow, heavy inevitability of a noose, the 300 Apache warriors forming a wall of muscle, paint, and sharpened weapons that cut Thomas Reddington off from every direction of escape. And though his fingers twitched toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail, he knew such a gesture would doom him instantly. For these were men raised on the warrior's path, men who could read fear, lies, and intent as clearly as tracking dust on the desert floor. And when the war chief dismounted, the ground seemed to shudder beneath his weight, his painted chest marked with thunder symbols, his long black hair braided with hawk feathers, and in his hand he carried a spear whose obsidian head glimmered like the night sky. Thomas tried to explain that the girl inside his cabin was alive because he'd helped her, not harmed her. But the chief spoke first, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the authority of generations, as he declared that Ayanna, daughter of the medicine woman of their people, heir to a sacred lineage, had vanished during the chaos of an enemy raid. And when scouts tracked her path through the desert, they discovered white man's footprints, white man's horse tracks, and signs that could be interpreted intentionally or not as abduction. And though Thomas swore by everything he held sacred that he had saved her life, not stolen it, the warriors around him muttered, spears shifting as tension rippled through their ranks like lightning crawling across the sky. The chief demanded proof, and Thomas knew the only chance for peace rested on Ayanna's voice. So he called her out, heart hammering as the cabin door creaked open and she stepped into view. Tall and proud again, her strength restored, her eyes sharp and burning with the same fierce dignity Thomas had seen the evening before. But now her presence transformed the mood. Instantly shouts rose, hands pointed. Warriors surged forward as though ready to tear Thomas apart for daring to touch her, until Ayanna raised both arms and unleashed a torrent of words in her native tongue, her voice slicing through the uproar like a blade. And whatever she said hit the warriors with the force of a storm, for they froze, listening, their hostility melting into confusion, then surprise, then something like reverence. She spoke of the heat that nearly killed her, of the water that saved her life, of the stranger who asked for nothing in return and treated her with respect even though he had every reason to fear her. And when she finished, the chief approached Thomas in silence, staring at him with eyes that could read a man's soul, before finally planting the butt of his spear into the dust and declaring that the Apache do not forget their enemies, but they never forget their debts either. The warriors around them lowered their weapons, murmuring assent as the chief extended his hand in a gesture of solemn gratitude. But the moment of peace quickly gave way to a deeper, darker truth as Ayanna revealed the full reason she had been alone and dying in the desert. The enemy raiders who struck her village were not settlers, not cavalry, but a brutal renegade band of Comancheros cutthroats and slavers who had taken several children captive, and who now planned to move through the valley near Thomas's ranch at dusk, using the canyon as a secret corridor to transport their captives. When the chief finished hearing her words, he turned to his warriors and declared that the Apache would ride to war, but that the land Thomas lived on, his ranch, his creek, his ridges, were now part of the battlefield, and he asked the rancher whether he would stand aside or stand with them. Thomas looked at the girl whose life he'd saved, at the warriors surrounding him, at the land he'd fought to carve a home upon, and he felt something ignite in him, not fear, not duty, but a raw, unyielding belief that no child should be dragged into darkness, while grown men did nothing. And with a slow nod he agreed, knowing full well that joining the Apache meant risking everything. The battle that followed as dusk bled across the canyon would become a story, whispered for generations. Warriors, moving like shadows, rifles cracking, arrows whistling, Thomas fighting shoulder to shoulder with men who hours earlier had nearly killed him. And when the dust settled and the last of the Comancheros fled into the night, the children were freed, the tribe reunited, and Thomas stood bloodied but unbroken beside Ayanna as the war chief proclaimed that the rancher would forever be considered a friend of their people, a title few outsiders had ever earned and even fewer had survived long enough to claim. When the warriors finally rode away beneath the starlit sky, leaving the ranch silent once more, Thomas felt the weight of what had happened settle over him, not fear, but a humbled sense of awe that one act of kindness, one canteen of water offered in a desert, had changed the course of so many lives. And years later, when he told the story to travelers passing through his land, he would always end it the same way. If you think a small act doesn't matter, remember this: give water to a stranger, and you might just find yourself surrounded by warriors who call you brother.